and the growth process inevitably suffered. This was soon accompanied by the global financial crisis, and we have seen already the impacts of that crisis. Last year, our exports fell by about 7%, and foreign direct investment was affected by about 30% last year. During the first 3 to 4 months of the current fiscal year, exports have actually registered an even steeper decline of almost 19%, and foreign direct investment has fallen by another 29%, although there's a little bit of a silver lining in terms of small but positive portfolio inflows. Most importantly, the war on terror, as I had suggested earlier, has imposed heavy costs on us. Today, the number of terrorist attacks has multiplied by about 10 times over the last 3 years. In 2008 alone, almost 7,000 people were killed as a result of collateral damage and, of course, because of the operations. Following research by the Institute of Public Policy in Lahore, it has been estimated that in the year 2008-9, the war on terror cost us 678 billion rupees. This is almost $8 billion, equivalent to as much as 5% of the GDP. Now, this is a very large magnitude, and many of these costs are costs which have been borne either by individuals, families, or even by the corporate private sector. I'd like to just highlight 1 or 2 of these major costs. We estimate now that the higher costs of security in the form of defense and police is costing us an additional 200 billion rupees. The damage to property and infrastructure, some of which is corporately owned, is over 100 billion rupees. The loss of economic growth in NWFP in particular is about 60 billion. The fall in private investment due to this, we estimate, at over 150 billion. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are very large magnitudes. And the fact that the growth rate of the economy has plummeted to 2% last year, a large part of this clearly is due to the exceptionally high costs that we are incurring in this fight against terrorism. And please also consider the fact that while this cost is close to $8 billion annually, reimbursements, particularly, for example, from the United States in the form of additional support, have been only about 1/4 of this magnitude. So much of the cost of this global war has been borne by the people of Pakistan. Now, this is not the end of the story. This perfect storm that I talked to you about also has had a dimension in the form of supply-side bottlenecks. The emergence of major bouts of power load shedding in 2008, initially fueled by circular debt problems, but also beginning to highlight the structural problem of underinvestment in power, has also imposed heavy costs on the corporate sector as well as on the overall private sector of the economy. Again, a study done by the Institute of Public Policy has quantified the costs of to the industrial sector of load shedding as close to rupees 210 billion in 2008-9, equivalent in this case to about 2% of the GDP. So these 2 shocks alone, if you like, or these 2 big happenings, have cost us 7% of the GDP. We have lost, according to this study, exports of up to $1 billion due to load shedding, and something like 500,000 jobs have been lost in the industrial sector due to load shedding. These numbers, by the way, are being presented for the first time. So, ladies and gentlemen, the last 2 years have been very difficult for us. Not only have we seen the global economy going into a state of recession, but on top of that, we have had our own extremely difficult domestic problems of terrorism, of supply-side bottlenecks, and of course, while all this was happening, a political transition. The consequences for economic policy have been obvious. Given the fact that by October last year, our reserves were down to critically low levels, inflation was rising exponentially, our foreign exchange reserves were being depleted, and the currency was falling by almost a rupee a day, it is clear that the first task for the government was to move towards a strong program of stabilization. And we were left with no option, eventually, to seek fast-track support in the form of a standby agreement with the International Monetary Fund. Since then, a number of steps have been taken, including, of course, difficult decisions by government late last year to raise petrol prices quite substantially. Since then, they have come down. There has been a sharp cutback in our development program by almost 20% last year. The State Bank of Pakistan raised the policy rate to a peak of almost 15%. And efforts were made to divert the pressure of government borrowing away from the central bank towards commercial banks. This process of stabilization has been facilitated, no doubt, by the sharp and almost as steep a fall in international prices, particularly of oil, that has helped us since then to stabilize the economy. The results today are significant, and we must recognize them. The economy has stabilized despite difficulties with the war situation and with supply-side factors. The current account deficit has been cut back sharply, almost to the point where we had a current account surplus recently in one of the months. We reduced the deficit by over $5 billion in 2008-9, and we have reduced it further by another $2 billion in the first quarter of this fiscal year. Reserves have gone up beyond $14 billion, although I think we must accept that a large part of the increase is due to higher borrowings from the IMF and others. The fiscal deficit has been reduced substantially from over 7.5% of the GDP to about 5% last year, and we have a target for this year of 5%. What is most reassuring, at least temporarily, is the very noticeable decline in the month-to-month, or if you like, probably more appropriately, the year-to-year rate of inflation. The rate of inflation now has finally come down once again to a single-digit rate of about 9%, from 25% or so, more or less the same time last year. But let me just warn you that I have a feeling that we will go back to a double-digit rate shortly as a result of some measures which we will take, including the rise in the prices or tariffs of electricity. So the primary task before government has been to stabilize the economy, and in that we have fortunately been aided this time by the fall in international prices, and there has been a degree of stabilization, but all this at the cost of growth. We had to literally bring the economy to a grinding halt to manage aggregate demand and our balance of payments. And the result is we had a growth of only about 2% last year, which means that per capita income was more or less constant, and industrial production declined quite sharply for the first time after a long period. And thanks to our agriculture, which came to our rescue, we were able to show a growth rate, as I said, of 2%, which, by the way, is higher